August 25, 1941, on the borders of northern and southwestern Iran at 4 a.m., the pre-dawn stillness was shattered by the coordinated roar of Soviet bombers and British naval artillery. For the Iranian people, the Second World War had finally arrived, not as a distant rumor from the European continent, but as a physical occupation of their homeland. Operation Countenance was swift and decisive. The Allied powers, desperate to secure a supply line to the Soviet Union and protect the vital oil fields of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, brushed aside Iranian neutrality. By 2 p.m. on that first day, the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East had been irrevocably altered. Iran was no longer a bystander. It was now the most critical piece of real estate in the Allied grand strategy, soon to be known as the Bridge of Victory. The challenge facing the Allies was staggering. To get American L-lease supplies from the Persian Gulf to the struggling Red Army in the north, they had to traverse some of the most hostile terrain on the planet. The route required crossing the scorching deserts of the south, where temperatures often peaked at 1 p.m. in the summer at over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, before assing into the jagged, snow-choked peaks of the Zagros and Alborz mountain ranges. The existing infrastructure was simply not up to the task. While the Trans-Iranian Railway was an incredible feat of engineering completed just 3 years prior, its single-track line and steep gradients were not designed for the millions of tons of war materiel that would soon arrive. This is where the story of the Iranian engineers begins. While the Allied military commanders provided the mission, it was the local experts and thousands of Iranian workers who provided the essential knowledge and labor. Iranian engineers had a profound understanding of the treacherous geology of their homeland. They knew how the flash floods in the canyons could wash away a bridge in minutes, and how the shifting desert sands could bury a road overnight. At 9:15 a.m., during the early weeks of the occupation, planning sessions in Tehran saw Iranian technical experts sitting across from British and American officers, translating the raw ambition of the Allied High Command into the practical reality of stone, steel, and asphalt. These men were tasked with a logistical miracle. They had to reinforce hundreds of bridges and expand the capacity of the railway by constructing new sidings and water stops for the steam locomotives. In the ports of Khorramshahr and Bandar Shahpur, the heat was so intense that work often had to stop at 12 p.m. and could only resume as the sun began to dip in the late afternoon. Yet the pace never truly slackened. The Iranian engineers managed the construction of vast assembly plants where trucks shipped in crates from the United States were put together at an astonishing rate. These vehicles would then be driven north by convoys that stretched for miles, navigated by local scouts who knew the mountain passes better than any map could detail. The Persian corridor became a testament to human endurance and collaborative engineering. By the peak of its operation, over 5 million tons of supplies had moved through this narrow funnel. This was not merely a feat of transport, it was a feat of creation. New roads were carved into cliffs that had seen only go-paths for centuries. Signal systems were modernized, and tunnels were widened, all under the shadow of a global conflict that threatened to consume everything. Reflecting on this era, we see that the victory in Europe was built upon the foundations laid in the Iranian dirt. The legacy of these architects and engineers is not found in statues, but in the enduring infrastructure that modernized a nation under the most duress imaginable. They proved that even in the darkest hours of an unwanted occupation, human ingenuity could bridge the gap between impossible odds and certain victory. Their work remains a poignant reminder that the grandest strategies of history are often held together by the quiet, tireless efforts of those who build the roads that lead to peace. Their sweat and stone became the silent pulse of the Allied war effort, ensuring that the light of the future would not be extinguished by the shadows of the present. September 1941, in the southern port of Khorramshahr, the humid air hung heavy over a landscape on the brink of a logistical revolution. The world was watching the tides of war shift across the European continent, but on the shores of the Persian Gulf, a different kind of battle was beginning. It was a battle of engineering, a struggle to move the mountains of equipment necessary to sustain an entire front. As the first British and Soviet ships docked, the immediate necessity became clear. The existing infrastructure of Iran, while impressive for its time, was not prepared for the crushing weight of a global conflict. This was where the local Iranian engineers stepped out of the shadows of civilian life and into the frantic urgency of military necessity. The mobilization was as much about intellectual capital as it was about physical labor. Iranian engineers, many of whom had spent years perfecting the Trans-Iranian Railway, were suddenly tasked with upgrading their life's work to meet the standards of a desperate Allied command. They did not just provide the muscle, they provided the memory of the land. At 9 a.m. in the drafting rooms of the Ministry of Roads, plans were being redrawn to accommodate the massive tonnage of American-made locomotives. These men knew the secrets of the Zagros Range, the treacherous curves where the mountain air would thin, and the gradients would stall any engine not calibrated for the altitude. As the project expanded, the scale of cooperation grew. By 1 p.m. under the scorching midday sun, Iranian bridge specialists worked side by side with American soldiers from the Persian Gulf Command. They were reinforcing the Varesk Bridge, a towering structure that looked like a needle threading the peaks of the north. The local engineers understood the thermal expansion of the stone and the seasonal winds that could buffet a train off its tracks. They were the ones who insisted on specific reinforcements that foreign designers had overlooked, ensuring the spans could handle the relentless vibration of supply trains passing every 20 minutes. The urgency of the situation meant that there was no room for error. At 30:15 p.m. on any given Tuesday, the ports would be a symphony of chaos and precision. Cranes were lifting crates of fighter planes, crates that had to be moved inland immediately to avoid clogging the docks. Iranian logistical experts organized the convoys, utilizing a vast network of local truck drivers who knew the ancient Silk Road routes better than any modern map could dictate. They transformed narrow, winding dirt paths into high-speed military highways. In the deserts, where the sand could reach temperatures high enough to melt rubber, they developed new asphalt mixtures that incorporated local materials, allowing the roads to withstand the heavy convoys that rolled north toward the Soviet border. The human element of this mobilization was perhaps the most striking. By 6 p.m., as the shadows grew long over the construction camps, thousands of laborers would be finishing their shifts, only to be replaced by the night crews. At 10 p.m., the glow of welding torches could be seen across the mountain passes as Iranian tunnel specialists worked to widen the clearances for oversized military cargo. This was a 24-hour cycle of ingenuity. The local engineers acted as cultural and technical mediators, translating the complex demands of the Allied High Command into actionable tasks for a diverse workforce. They were the glue that held the bridge to victory together. The legacy of this period is etched into the very topography of the region. Long after the last soldier departed and the fires of war were extinguished, the roads and rails remained, serving as the backbone for Iran's post-war development. The deep reflection on this era reveals a poignant truth. The grandest strategies of generals are meaningless without the quiet, tireless efforts of the builders. The Iranian engineers who mobilized their skills in the 1940s were not just supporting a war effort. They were building the future of their own nation while saving another. Their work serves as a permanent reminder that even in the midst of a global tragedy, human ingenuity can create something that outlasts the conflict itself. They built not just for the moment, but for the ages, proving that stone and steel, when guided by local wisdom, can bridge any divide. Their sweat and stone became the silent pulse of the Allied war effort, ensuring that the light of the future would not be extinguished by the shadows of the present. As the sun sets at 7 p.m., over the modernized peaks of the Zagros today, the trains still rumble over the tracks laid during those frantic years, a haunting and beautiful echo of a time when local expertise met global urgency to change the course of history. November 1942, deep within the jagged peaks of the Zagros Mountains, the silence of the ancient wilderness was shattered by the deafening roar of industrial progress. The Trans-Iranian Railway was already a masterpiece of pre-war ambition, but by the autumn of 1942, it had been transformed into the most critical artery in the global struggle against the Axis powers. The world came to know it as the Persian Corridor, a lifeline inted to feed the starving Soviet war machine as it stood on the brink at Stalingrad. But between the warm waters of the Persian Gulf and the Caspian steppes stood the Zagros Range, a formidable gatekeeper rising thousands of feet into the thin air with slopes so steep they seemed to defy the very laws of physics. To meet the desperate demands of the Allied High Command, the existing infrastructure had to be expanded and reinforced at a pace that many Western observers deemed suicidal. Iranian engineers, the men who had spent the previous decade carving the original route through the rock, were now thrust into a frantic race against time. At 3 p.m., on any given afternoon, a team of local surveyors could be found clinging to a limestone cliffside, marking the path for a new siding or a reinforced tunnel entrance, while the temperature in the lowlands below soared past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The Zagros was a landscape of brutal extremes. In the northern reaches, mountain passes were frequently choked with snow that could bury a locomotive in minutes, while in the southern stretches, the intense humidity of the Gulf rusted heavy equipment almost as fast as it could be offloaded. The technical challenge was staggering. The engineers had to design a series of intricate loops and spirals, a masterpiece of vertical navigation that allowed massive freight trains to climb 7,000 feet without the steam engine stalling or the mechanical brakes failing. Every bridge was a gamble against gravity and the tectonic instability of the region. Iranian laborers, working in tandem with the American Persian Gulf Command and British technical advisors, utilized local stone and centuries-old masonry techniques to reinforce embankments that were being pounded daily by 2,000-ton supply trains. By 9 a.m. Each morning, the logistical headquarters in Tehran would receive reports on the tonnage of wheat, aviation fuel, and tanks that had successfully crested the high passes. These were not just numbers on a ledger. They were the pulses of a global effort to turn the tide of the war. The human cost of this engineering miracle was immense. It was not just a battle of iron and steam, but a battle of sheer human endurance. The Iranian workforce bore the brunt of the physical labor, navigating tunnels that were often suffocating chambers of heat and coal smoke. Some of these tunnels stretched for over 2 miles, and inside, the air became so thick with exhaust that workers had to be rotated every 30 minutes to prevent collapse. Yet, the work never stopped. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon at 6 p.m., the glow of lanterns and welding torches would illuminate the mountain passes like a string of fallen stars, a visible sign that the corridor was open and the supplies were moving. By mid-1943, the throughput of the railway had tripled. The supplies moving through these mountains were directly responsible for the Soviet counteroffensives that would eventually break the back of the German army. Without the local expertise of the Iranian engineers men who understood the shifting sands of the plains and the brittle, unforgiving nature of the Zagros limestone, the Allied supply chain would have likely collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. They were the silent partners in the victory, the men who knew exactly where to place the dynamite and how to brace the timber when the earth began to tremble. Today, the legacy of the Zagros expansion is not merely found in the weathered concrete of the bridge supports or the dark mouths of the mountain tunnels. It is found in the very survival of the modern world. The tracks laid during those feverish years were the stitches that held a fractured alliance together when it was at its most vulnerable. As the wind whistles through the high passes at 1 a.m., one can almost hear the phantom rhythmic clank of those heavily laden trains, a permanent echo of a time when local genius met global necessity. Their work stands as a poignant reminder that while history is often written by those who carry the swords, it is built by those who carry the transit and the trowel. The Trans-Iranian Railway remains a monument to the idea that no mountain is impassable when the collective will of a people is forged in the fires of a common cause. August 25, 1941. The humid air over the Persian Gulf city of Abadan hung heavy with the scent of crude oil and the sudden, sharp tension of an impending global shift. As Allied forces moved to secure the region, the focus of the world's military planners narrowed onto a single, massive industrial complex that would dictate the pace of the war in Europe and the East. While the Trans-Iranian Railway served as the spine of the supply line, The refineries and pipelines of Iran were the very lifeblood of the Allied cause. At the center of this industrial storm were the Iranian engineers and technicians whose expertise transformed Abadan into the largest and most productive refinery on the planet. For these men, the war was not fought with bayonets, but with pressure valves, chemical catalysts, and blueprints. By 8 a.m. each morning, shifts of local engineers were already deep into the blueprints of modernization, tasked with an objective that seemed nearly impossible, increasing the output of high-octane aviation spirit to levels never before seen in the Middle East. The Royal Air Force and the Soviet Air Force were starving for 100-octane fuel, the high-performance propellant required for Spitfires and Yak fighters to outmaneuver the Luftwaffe. It was the Iranian technical class that bridged the gap between raw natural resource and refined military necessity. They worked in the sweltering heat, often reaching 120 degrees Fahrenheit, to ensure that the distillation towers never cooled and the flow never faltered. The scale of the expansion was staggering. Thousands of miles of new pipelines had to be laid across unforgiving salt flats and jagged ridges to connect the inland wells of Masjid-i-Sulaiman and Gacharan to the coastal terminals. Iranian civil engineers led the way, navigating the complex geology of the Zagros foothills to ensure the steady pulse of crude oil. By 3:15 ppm, on any given afternoon during the height of the 1943 expansion, one could see the horizon of Abadan shimmering with the construction of new thermal cracking units and stabilization plants. These were not mere temporary wartime fixes. They were sophisticated feats of engineering that required a deep understanding of fluid dynamics and metallurgy. This was a logistical ballet performed under the shadow of catastrophe. Every gallon of fuel produced in Iran and sent north to the Soviet Union or south to the Pacific Theater saved lives on the front lines. Iranian engineers perfected the art of the quick fix and the long-term upgrade simultaneously. When spare parts from Europe or America were delayed by U-boat blockades, it was the local workshops and the ingenuity of Persian mechanics that fabricated replacements from scrap, keeping the pumps roaring through the night. At 11 p.m., while the rest of the world slept in the silence of the blackout, the glow of the Abadan flares remained a beacon of industrial defiance, visible for miles across the Shatt al-Arab. As the war progressed, the infrastructure expanded beyond just the refineries. New jetties were constructed to handle the massive tankers, and sophisticated storage farms were built to hold millions of barrels of refined products. The Iranian engineers managed the delicate balance of maintaining ancient water systems while integrating modern industrial cooling towers, a synthesis of traditional knowledge and cutting-edge science. They were the silent partners in the victory at Stalingrad and the liberation of Europe, providing the literal energy that moved the tanks and flew the bombers. The legacy of these architects of energy acts far beyond the final ceasefire. Their work in the refineries of the 1940s laid the foundation for Iran's modern industrial identity, proving that the nation possessed the intellectual and technical grit to manage the world's most complex systems. We often remember the generals who commanded the divisions, but we must also remember the men who stood over the glowing heat of the refineries at 4 a.m., ensuring the pressure stayed steady. They understood that in a total war, a well-placed weld is as vital as a well-aimed shot. Their contribution is etched into the steel of every pipe and the concrete of every pier that remains standing today. It is a testament to the fact that victory is not only won on the battlefield, but in the quiet, focused brilliance of those who harness the elements to power the world's survival. Their story is a reminder that the true architects of peace are often those who spare lives building the foundations upon which the rest of us stand. January 1943, in the unforgiving salt deserts of central Iran, the air shimmered with a heat so intense it could buckle untreated steel. While the world's attention was fixed on the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, a different kind of war was being waged here. It was a war against geography, against the clock, and against the very limits of human endurance. The Iranian engineers who had spent decades dreaming of a modernized nation now found themselves at the center of the world's most critical supply line. They were the ones tasked with ensuring that the torrent of American tanks, British planes and millions of tons of food reached the Soviet front before the tide of the war could turn back in favor of the Axis. The Trans-Iranian Railway was a marvel of pre-war engineering, but it was never intended to carry the sheer weight of a global conflict. By 3 p.m. on any given afternoon, the temperature inside the driver's cabs of the locomotives could reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The mountain passes of the Alborz Range presented a vertical labyrinth of over 200 tunnels and hundreds of bridges. Iranian engineers worked alongside Allied specialists to reinforce these spans, often performing complex structural calculations on the fly, as heavy Sherman tanks and crates of ammunition tested the limits of concrete and iron. They had to solve the puzzle of transitioning from the coastal humidity of the south to the sub-zero winters of the northern mountains, all while keeping the locomotives running without a single day of rest. The ports of the Persian Gulf were another bottleneck that required constant ingenuity. At Bandar Shahpur, the tides could fluctuate as much as 20 feet, threatening to swamp the makeshift piers. It was here that local engineers proved their worth, designing modular berthing systems and organizing labor crews that worked in shifts around the clock. At 11 a.m., the docks would be a chaotic symphony of shouting voices and grinding cranes. But by 11:45 p.m., the same crews would be clearing the way for the next convoy, their efficiency increasing with every passing month. They were not just moving crates, they were managing the lifeblood of the Red Army, ensuring that the sheer volume of material did not cause the entire system to collapse under its own weight. Beyond the rails lay the roads. The Iranian plateau is a jagged landscape of gravel and silt, a place where a truck's engine could be choked to death by dust in a matter of hours. To maintain the flow of the Persian corridor, thousands of miles of road had to be paved or reinforced. Iranian engineers utilized local materials to create durable surfaces that could withstand the relentless pounding of 10-ton trucks. They dealt with flash floods that could wash away a week's worth of work in a matter of minutes. When a bridge collapsed near the Zagros Mountains at 4 a.m. during a spring thaw, it was the local engineering teams who were on the scene by 6:15 a.m., improvising repairs with timber and scrap metal to ensure the convoy did not stop for more than a few hours. The technical obstacles were matched only by the environmental ones. The engineers had to design cooling systems for engines that were never meant for the desert and heating systems for pipes that would crack in the mountain frost. They were the silent partners in a feat of logistics that many thought impossible. This was the bridge to victory, a massive arterial system carved through some of the most difficult terrain on the planet. The legacy of these engineers is often overshadowed by the names of generals and the movements of armies, yet without their technical mastery, the weapons of the West would have remained idle in the docks of the Persian Gulf. Their work transformed Iran into a global crossroads, proving that even in the darkest hours of human history, the act of creation can be as powerful as the act of combat. These men did more than just lay tracks and pour concrete. They built a lifeline for a world on the brink of collapse. Their story is a reminder that the endurance of a nation is often found in the quiet persistence of its builders. They stood at the intersection of East and West, turning a rugged landscape into a pathway for liberation. The bridges they built may have weathered over the decades, but the foundation of global cooperation they established remains a testament to what can be achieved when the brilliance of the mind is set against the most daunting odds of the earth. We look back at their achievements not just as a feat of wartime necessity, but as a profound statement on human resilience. The true architects of peace are those who bridge the gaps between nations, ensuring that even in the midst of total war, the world remains connected by the enduring strength of steel and the unwavering spirit of those who know how to shape it. September 1945, Tehran. The relentless thunder of the heavy locomotives that had defined life in the capital for 4 years finally began to soften into a rhythmic, peaceful hum. As the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Alborz Mountains at 6 p.m., a quiet realization settled over the rail yards and the drafting rooms. The Great War was over. The frantic rush to supply the Eastern Front had ceased, and the thousands of Iranian engineers, technicians, and laborers who had formed the backbone of the Persian corridor found themselves standing amidst the monumental infrastructure they had helped create. They were the silent partners in a global struggle, men who had moved mountains and bridged chasms so that the world might remain free, yet their names were rarely written in the headlines of the London or New York papers. History has a tendency to remember the flash of the muzzle and the tactical brilliance of the general, but the true story of the Allied victory is often found in the grease of the axle and the precision of the surveyor's transit. These Iranian engineers faced a task that many Western experts initially deemed impossible. They were asked to maintain and expand a railway that climbed from the sweltering sea-level flats of the Persian Gulf to heights of over 7,000 feet, all while enduring temperatures that could swing from a blistering 120 degrees in the desert to a bone-chilling sub-zero in the mountain passes. At 4 a.m., on any given winter morning during the height of the war, these men were out in the elements, clearing snow from tracks and ensuring that the vital pulse of LE's supplies never skipped a beat. The legacy they left behind is not merely one of steel and stone, but of a profound technological leap that transformed the face of their nation. The Trans-Iranian Railway was a masterpiece of human ingenuity, featuring over 200 tunnels and some of the most daring bridge designs in the world. The Veris Bridge, standing like a sentinel over a deep mountain gorge, remains a testament to the fact that when the world called for a miracle, the Iranian spirit provided the foundation. By the time the last supply train departed for the Soviet border at 11:30 a.m., on that final day of wartime operations, over 5 million tons of war materiel had passed through the corridor. This was the fuel, the food, and the machinery that broke the back of the Axis at Stalingrad and paved the way to Berlin. We must reflect on the fact that these engineers were building more than just a supply line. They were building a bridge between civilizations. In an era defined by division and destruction, the construction of the Persian corridor was an act of profound creation. It required the seamless integration of Iranian local knowledge with British logistics and American industrial might. The Iranian engineers were the essential translators of this effort, turning abstract blueprints into physical realities that could withstand the harshest terrain on Earth. They proved that the brilliance of the human mind knows no borders, and that the drive to overcome impossible odds is a universal language. Today, as modern trains glide over those same tracks, we are reminded that the infrastructure of peace is often built during the darkest hours of war. The tunnels they carved through the granite of the Zagros Mountains still echo with the memory of their labor. The bridges they reinforced still carry the weight of a nation's commerce. But the most enduring legacy of the Iranian wartime engineers is the reminder that no victory is won in isolation. They were the architects of a connection that saved millions of lives, providing the oxygen that kept the Allied cause breathing when it was most suffocated by the grip of tyranny. As we look back at the soot-stained faces and the calloused hands of those who served in the rail yards of Avaz and the workshops of Arak, we see the faces of the unsung heroes of the 20th century. They did not ask for glory, yet they provided the very foundation upon which the modern world was rebuilt. Their work stands as a poignant reminder that while wars are fought with weapons, they are won to the quiet, steady persistence of those who know how to build. The steel may rust, and the stone may weather, but the spirit of the Iranian engineers who built the bridge to victory remains an unshakable pillar of our shared history, a testament to the enduring power of human resilience and the silent brilliance that moves the world forward.